What is going on here? And how did you get the keys? I demanded, my voice echoing off the brick walls of my apartment building. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, making the scene feel even more surreal. Mark, my ex of 8 months, froze like a deer in headlights, a cardboard box suspended between his hands. His mother, Linda, turned slowly from where she stood by the trunk of her silver Lexus, her perfectly styled blonde hair swaying with the movement. "Sarah, dear," Linda started in that syrupy voice I hadn't missed. "We tried calling you several times." "That doesn't answer either of my questions," I said, climbing the 3 steps to my front door. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to appear calm. The door stood slightly ajar, and I could see more boxes stacked in my living room. My living room? Mark finally found his voice. "Look, it's not what you think. Mom still had her emergency key from when we were—" "The key I asked you both to return after the divorce?" I cut him off, feeling the familiar anger rising in my chest. The same anger I'd felt when I discovered he'd been working late with his colleague Jessica for 6 months. Linda stepped forward, designer heels clicking on concrete. "Now, Sarah, there's no need for hostility. We're just collecting the last of Mark's things." "His things? He moved everything out last summer. I made sure of it." Thunder rumbled in the distance as I stepped into my apartment, taking in the chaos. They'd been thorough, dresser drawers hung open, closet doors gaped wide, and even my kitchen cabinets had been ransacked. The framed photos I'd carefully curated on my walls were gone, leaving behind lighter squares of paint. "Those photos were mine," I said, turning to face them. "The ones from our trip to Yellowstone? I took those, with my camera." Mark had the decency to look uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Yeah, but they're of both of us, and I wanted—" "You don't get to want things from my home anymore." My voice cracked slightly. "You gave up that right when you moved in with Jessica." Linda's perfectly plucked eyebrows drew together. "Mark tells me you've been seeing someone new yourself. That IT person from your office?" The fact that Mark had been keeping tabs on me sent a fresh wave of anger through my body. Yes, I'd had coffee with Dan from IT a few times, but that was none of their business. Besides, it had been months after the divorce, not while we were still married. "Get out," I said quietly, my hands shaking as I pulled out my phone. "Get out now, or I'm calling the police and reporting a break-in." Mark stepped toward me, his hands raised in what he probably thought was a calming gesture. "Come on, Sarah, don't be dramatic. We used a key." "A key you weren't supposed to have," I was shouting now, past caring what my neighbors might think. "This is breaking and entering, Mark. You can't just—" I stopped, noticing something else. "Where's my grandmother's jewelry box?" Linda's face twitched almost imperceptibly. "The silver one? Darling, Mark's grandmother gave that to us as a wedding present." "Nope." I practically spat the word. "My Nana Lewis gave it to me when I graduated high school, 5 years before I even met your son." I stormed past them to my bedroom, where the antique box had sat on my dresser every day since I was 18. The empty space felt like a punch to the gut. "It must have been a similar box," Linda said smoothly. "You know how memories can get confused?" "Put it back." I turned slowly, meeting her eyes. "Put it back, along with everything else you've taken that isn't Mark's. I have photos of every item in this apartment for insurance purposes, with dates. Would you like me to show the police those pictures?" Mark's face had gone pale. He looked at his mother, then back at me. "Mom? Is she right about the jewelry box?" Linda's composure cracked slightly. "Mark, honey, I just thought—" "Well, it matched your grandmother's collection so perfectly. And since Sarah clearly moved on so quickly after your marriage ended—" "Moved on?" I laughed, but there wasn't any humor in it. "I spent 6 months crying myself to sleep while your son was building his new life with Jessica, and now you're trying to steal my family heirlooms?" I watched Mark's expression shift from confusion to realization to something that looked almost like shame. Without a word, he walked to his mother's car and opened the back door. The familiar silver box sat nestled between 2 cardboard containers labeled photos. "I didn't know," he said quietly, retrieving the box. "Mom told me it was Grandma Rose's." He held it out to me, but I didn't move to take it. "Check the bottom," I said, crossing my arms. "There's an engraving." Mark turned the box over. I knew what he would find. "To Sarah, with love from Nana Lewis, 2015. I'd traced those words with my fingers countless times during the worst days of our divorce. "Mom?" Mark's voice had taken on an edge I recognized from our marriage, the tone he used when he was trying not to lose his temper. "What else did you tell me was ours?" Linda's perfect mask finally cracked completely. She smoothed her expensive blouse, a nervous habit I remembered well from family dinners, and glanced between us. I was only trying to protect what's rightfully ours, what should stay in the family. I'm not family anymore, I reminded her, taking the jewelry box from Mark's hands. You both made that very clear. The serving plates, Mark said suddenly. The ones you said came from Aunt Sophie? Were those Sarah's too? I felt a small, bitter satisfaction watching Linda squirm. Those plates, hand-painted Italian ceramics, had been a housewarming gift from my best friend when I first moved to the city. They'd survived 3 apartments, my marriage, and my divorce. Or so I'd thought. They're in the trunk, Linda admitted, not meeting either of our eyes. Along with the coffee table books and that little abstract painting from the hallway. Mark ran his hands through his hair, another familiar gesture that used to make my heart flutter. Now it just made me tired. Jesus, Mom. I trusted you when you said you'd talk to Sarah about collecting these things. That's why I gave you the key. You what? I turned on him. You gave her the key I specifically asked you both to return? I thought. Mark trailed off, looking lost. She said she was going to coordinate with you about some family items we'd forgotten. I didn't think she'd just show up and... He gestured helplessly at the mess around us. The sound of my neighbor's door opening down the hall made us all freeze. Mrs. Chen poked her head out, concern written across her face. Sarah? Is everything okay? I heard shouting. It's fine, Mrs. Chen, I managed, trying to sound calmer than I felt. Just a misunderstanding. It's being handled. She didn't look convinced, but nodded slowly. I'm right next door if you need anything, dear. The implied threat in her voice, directed at Mark and Linda, was clear. She'd been there through the worst of my divorce, bringing me homemade dumplings and letting me cry on her couch. After her door clicked shut, I turned back to my unwanted visitors. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to bring back everything you took. Then you're going to leave, both of you, and return my key. If anything, and I mean anything, is missing or damaged, I'm calling the police. Linda opened her mouth to protest, but Mark cut her off. We'll bring it all back. Now. He gave his mother a hard look. All of it, Mom. I stood in my doorway, arms crossed, watching as they made trip after trip from the car. The serving plates, my art books, the painting my college roommate had made. Each item that returned to its place felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. Linda kept trying to explain, her words becoming increasingly desperate. Sarah, you have to understand, when Mark married you, you became like a daughter to me. After the divorce, losing you was like losing part of our family. So you decided to steal my belongings? I shook my head. That's not love, Linda. That's possession. There's a difference. Thunder cracked again, closer this time, and the first fat drops of rain began to fall. Mark hurried to bring in the last box, water darkening his gray t-shirt, the same shirt he used to wear on Sunday mornings when we'd make pancakes together. The memory hit me unexpectedly, and I had to look away. I think that's everything, he said quietly, setting down a box of photo albums. But you should check to be sure. I nodded, still not looking at him. Put the key on the counter and go. Both of you. Sarah, Linda tried one last time. Perhaps we could all get coffee sometime, talk things through. No. The word came out softer than I expected. We can't. The rain was falling steadily now as they walked to the car. I watched from my doorway as Mark helped his mother in, her designer shoes already spattered with water. He looked back at me once, opened his mouth as if to say something, then thought better of it. The sound of car doors closing echoed through the parking lot. As their taillights disappeared around the corner, my legs finally gave out. I sank down onto my couch, the familiar texture of the fabric grounding me. Mrs. Chen's door opened again, and a moment later, she was at my side, holding a steaming mug of jasmine tea. I heard everything, she said simply, pressing the warm mug into my hands. Some people never learn to let go properly. I took a shaky sip of tea. I thought I was past all this, past them. But seeing them here, in my space, I gestured at the apartment where evidence of their intrusion still lingered in open drawers and displaced cushions. The past doesn't always stay where we put it, Mrs. Chen said wisely. Sometimes it shows up uninvited with a stolen key and starts going through our cabinets. Despite everything, I found myself laughing. It was either that or cry, and I'd done enough crying over Mark and his family. Through the window, I watched the rain intensify, turning the world gray and soft-focused. My reflection stared back at me, and for a moment I saw myself as I'd been a year ago, broken, lost, wondering if I'd ever feel whole again. But that wasn't me anymore. I need to change my locks, I said, setting down the empty tea mug. First thing tomorrow. Mrs. Chen nodded approvingly. My nephew's a locksmith. I'll text you his number. Good rates, very professional. I started moving through my apartment, straightening things, reclaiming my space. Each item they'd touch needed to be put back exactly where I wanted it, not where they thought it should go. The jewelry box went back on my dresser, but I moved it to the left side instead of the right. A small change, but it felt significant. My phone buzzed. A text from Mark. I'm sorry about Mom, and about keeping the key. It won't happen again. I stared at the message for a long moment before deleting it without responding. Some apologies came too late to matter. Besides, actions spoke louder than words, and his actions today had said plenty. Would you like to come over for dinner? Mrs. Chen asked. I'm making hot pot. Actually, yes, I said, surprising myself. I'd like that a lot. The thought of sitting alone in my apartment right now, with everything slightly out of place, made my skin crawl. As I helped Mrs. Chen chop vegetables for the hot pot, the rhythmic motion of the knife against the cutting board soothed my jangled nerves. Steam rose from the simmering broth, carrying the scent of ginger and star anise. You know, she said, dropping thin slices of beef into the pot, when my husband died, his sister tried to take his mother's jade pendant, said it should stay with blood family. She shook her head, a small smile playing at her lips. I wore it to every family gathering for the next 10 years. I laughed, really laughed, for the first time that day. What did she do? Oh, she fumed, made comments. But what could she do? Sometimes the best revenge is simply living well. She passed me a bowl of noodles, and remembering to change your locks. The food was delicious, but it was the company that really helped. Mrs. Chen didn't try to make me talk about what happened, or offer platitudes about everything happening for a reason. She just let me be, sharing her food and occasional bits of hard-won wisdom. By the time I returned to my apartment, the rain had stopped. The air felt cleaner somehow, as if the storm had washed away more than just dust and pollen. I moved through my room slowly, taking inventory. The photos they'd taken, I could reprint those. Maybe I'd frame some new ones instead, from my trip to Montreal last month. The empty spaces on my walls didn't have to be filled with memories of Mark anymore. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Linda. I hope you'll reconsider coffee. Family is family, even after divorce. I blocked her number. In my bedroom, I opened the silver jewelry box, checking that everything was still there. My grandmother's pearl earrings, the delicate chain my parents gave me for graduation, the small sapphire ring that had been my great-aunt's. Each piece carried its own history, none of which had anything to do with Mark or Linda. A new text appeared from Dan in IT. Still on for lunch tomorrow? I smiled, remembering how he'd helped me set up my new computer after the divorce, making me laugh with his terrible tech puns. Absolutely, I typed back. But I might need to leave early, getting my locks changed. I woke the next morning feeling more centered. The apartment still held traces of yesterday's invasion, a few things out of place, a lingering sense of violation, but it no longer felt overwhelming. I opened my windows wide, letting in the post-rain freshness and the sound of early morning traffic. Dan had responded to my text, "Locks? Everything okay?" "Long story," I wrote back. "Tell you over lunch." As I got ready for work, I found myself studying my reflection more carefully than usual. The woman in the mirror looked stronger than she had a year ago, more certain. The divorce had broken me, yes, but I'd put myself back together in a way that made me proud. My phone rang, Mark's number. I let it go to voicemail, then listened as I put on my makeup. "Sarah, it's me. I found more things Mom took. Photos of your family, some books I know were yours. I'd like to return them. The right way this time. Just let me know how you want to handle it." I deleted the message and finished applying my mascara. He could mail them to my office. I didn't need to see him again, didn't need to reopen that door even a crack. Outside, the city was coming to life. A delivery truck beeped as it backed into the coffee shop across the street. The early morning regulars were already lining up for their caffeine fix. My life had developed its own comfortable rhythms in the months since the divorce, and yesterday's disruption had only highlighted how far I'd come. I texted Mark back a simple message. "Mail them to my office, 350 Madison Avenue, Suite 1200. Then I blocked his number too. On my way to work, I stopped at my usual coffee shop. Tommy, the barista who'd witnessed my post-divorce transformation from zombie to human, had my order ready. "You look different today," he said, sliding my latte across the counter. "Good different." "Had some ghosts show up yesterday," I replied, dropping $1 in the tip jar. "Finally got rid of them." "Ghosts are overrated," he grinned. "The living have much better coffee." At the office, I found Dan waiting by my desk, 2 fresh bagels in hand. "Thought you might need breakfast," he said. "You seemed off in your texts." I felt something warm bloom in my chest that had nothing to do with coffee. You have no idea how perfect that is. I didn't tell Dan everything over those bagels, just enough. About finding my ex and his mother in my apartment, about the jewelry box, about finally blocking their numbers. He listened quietly, his face darkening when I mentioned the key. "That's not okay," he said simply. "Any of it. Want me to go with you to the locksmith?" The offer touched me, but I shook my head. "Mrs. Chen's nephew is handling it, but thank you, really. Offer stands for anything else you need," he said, then grinned. "Including setting up a killer security system. I know a guy." Back at my desk, I found myself thinking about choices. About the moment I discovered Mark's affair, a carelessly open email on his laptop, and how it had felt like the end of the world. But sitting here now, with a taste of coffee and bagels still on my tongue and Dan's genuine concern warming me, it felt more like a beginning. My phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Chen's nephew. 2 p.m. for the locks? "Perfect," I replied, then opened my work email. The quarterly reports weren't going to review themselves, and I had a life to live. The locksmith turned out to be efficient and understanding, not asking questions when I requested the most secure locks he had available. "Smart choice," was all he said, showing me how the new mechanism worked. By the time he left, my apartment felt like mine again. The new keys felt different in my hand, heavier, more substantial. I ran my thumb over the fresh-cut ridges, appreciating how they symbolized this latest clean break from my past. I spent the rest of the afternoon rearranging things, not just putting them back where they'd been, but finding new places. The serving plates went in a different cabinet. I moved my desk to face the window instead of the wall. Small changes, but they mattered. In my bedroom closet, I found one last trace of Mark, an old college sweatshirt of his I'd kept for sleeping. I'd held onto it out of habit more than anything else, but now its presence felt wrong. I dropped it in a donation bag without a second thought. My phone lit up with a text from Linda, from a new number, since I'd blocked her other one. I deleted it without reading it and blocked that number too. Some people never learned, but I had. The sunset painted my newly rearranged apartment in shades of amber and rose. I sat on my couch, a glass of wine in hand, and thought about boundaries. About how some people crash through them like they don't exist, while others, like Mrs. Chen and Dan, respect them instinctively. A quick check of my security camera app showed my new hallway view was working perfectly. Another layer of protection. Another way to make sure yesterday couldn't repeat itself. My laptop chimed with an email from work. A new project, starting next week. The client was a security firm, ironically enough, looking to revamp their entire digital presence. The old me might have felt overwhelmed by the scope. The new me was already mapping out strategies. Mrs. Chen knocked softly, bringing over leftover dumplings. "New locks all good?" "Perfect," I said, letting her in. "Want to stay for wine?" She settled into my armchair, now positioned by the window instead of against the wall, and accepted a glass. "You know," she said, "my husband used to say that good boundaries are like good fences. They don't just keep people out, they let you decide who to welcome in." I raised my glass to that. The next morning, a courier delivery arrived at my office. A small box, neatly wrapped, with Mark's precise handwriting on the label. Inside were the family photos he'd mentioned, some books I'd forgotten about, and a brief note, "I'm sorry. For everything. Not just yesterday." I slipped the photos into my desk drawer to deal with later. The books I'd donate, I'd already replaced most of them anyway. The note went straight into the shredder. Dan caught my eye from across the office and raised an eyebrow in question. I gave him a thumbs up and turned back to my work. The security firm project needed my attention, and I was determined to nail the preliminary presentation. During lunch, I walked to the park near our building. The trees were just starting to bud, tiny green promises of spring. A year ago, I'd sat on these same benches crying over divorce papers. Now, I was making notes about client presentations and thinking about asking Dan if he wanted to try that new Thai place downtown. My phone buzzed, Mrs. Chen sending me an invitation to her weekly mahjong night. Time you learned, her message said. Bring wine. I smiled and typed back, count me in. Life has a way of moving forward in small increments, I thought as I worked through my afternoon meetings. One day, you're falling apart, and the next, you're planning mahjong nights and office presentations. The changes are so gradual you barely notice them, until something or someone from your past shows up to highlight how far you've come. Late afternoon, sunlight streamed through the office windows as I finished my last call of the day. Dan was packing up his laptop at his desk, and before I could overthink it, I went over. Hey, I said, trying to sound casual. That Thai place you mentioned last week, want to check it out tonight? His smile lit up his whole face. I thought you'd never ask. As we walked to the restaurant, our conversation flowing easily, I realized something. I wasn't thinking about Mark anymore, or Linda, or yesterday's invasion. Instead, I was thinking about how Dan's eyes crinkled when he laughed, and how the evening air felt crisp and full of possibilities. Sometimes the best revenge really is living well, I thought, remembering Mrs. Chen's words. And sometimes moving forward means simply opening yourself to what comes next. The Thai restaurant was tucked into a converted brownstone, string lights twinkling in its windows. Inside, the aroma of lemongrass and basil wrapped around us like a warm embrace. Dan pulled out my chair, not with any grand gesture, just a simple courtesy that felt natural. So, he said, after we'd ordered, how are you really doing, after yesterday? I considered the question carefully, stirring my Thai iced tea. You know what? I'm good. Actually good. Yesterday was a reminder, I guess, of who I was and who I am now. And who are you now? His question was gentle, curious. Someone who changes her locks, I said with a small laugh. Someone who knows what she wants and what she doesn't. Someone who's ready for. I gestured vaguely at the space between us, whatever comes next. The food arrived, steam rising from perfectly arranged plates, colors bright and inviting. As we shared bites of each other's dishes and traded stories about our day, I felt something settle inside me. A certainty, maybe. Or just contentment. Outside the restaurant later, the city hummed with its usual evening energy. Streetlights cast warm pools on the sidewalk, and somewhere distant, a saxophone player was working through a jazz standard. I can walk you home, Dan offered, his hands in his pockets. I'd like that, I said, and meant it. We took the long way, past the park where I'd once cried over my divorce papers. The benches were empty now, peaceful in the gathering dusk. A light breeze carried the scent of blooming trees and possibility. At my door, I paused with my new key in hand. Thank you, I said. Not just for dinner, but for being there. Yesterday, today, all of it. Sarah, he said softly, I'll always be there, as long as you want me to be. I reached for his hand, and as our fingers intertwined, I thought about doors, the ones that close, the ones that open, and the ones we choose to walk through when we're finally ready. Would you like to come up for coffee? I asked. His answer was a smile that felt like sunrise.